The sound of shattering glass echoed through the general store, and Natalie Crawford's heart stopped as she watched 3 months' worth of wages slip through her trembling fingers onto the wooden floor. It was the spring of 1882 in Snowflake, Arizona, and the afternoon sun blazed through the storefront windows of Patterson's general store with an intensity that made everything inside feel like it was baking slowly. Natalie had been working for Marcus Patterson for nearly 6 months now, ever since she'd arrived in town with nothing but a worn carpetbag and desperation in her eyes. The work was honest, the pay was fair, and she'd finally started to believe she might have a future in this dusty frontier town. But now, as she stared at the broken jar of expensive imported preserves spreading across the floorboards, she knew her luck had run out. What in God's name is going on out here? Marcus Patterson's voice boomed from the back room, and Natalie felt her stomach drop. She scrambled to her knees, trying desperately to salvage what she could, but the sticky mess was already seeping between the floorboards. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Patterson," she said quickly, her voice shaking. "I'll pay for it, every cent. I'll work extra hours, whatever you need." Patterson emerged from the back room, his round face flushed red with heat and irritation. He was a portly man in his 50s, with thinning hair and a perpetually suspicious expression that had only grown worse in recent weeks. "That's $3 worth of merchandise, girl. $3. Do you have any idea how much that costs to ship out here?" I know, I'm sorry," Natalie repeated, fighting back tears as she used her apron to try to mop up the mess. "It slipped right out of my hands. I don't know how it happened." Patterson's eyes narrowed as he looked from the broken jar to Natalie's face, then back again. Something shifted in his expression, something that made Natalie's blood run cold. "This is the 3rd incident this week," he said slowly. "First the missing money from the till, then the inventory that doesn't match my records, and now this." "I don't understand what you're suggesting," Natalie said, but she did understand, all too well. She could see the accusation forming in his eyes before he even spoke the words. "I'm suggesting that maybe you've been helping yourself to more than your wages," Patterson said coldly. "I'm suggesting that maybe you've been stealing from me, Miss Crawford." The words hit her like a physical blow. Natalie stood up so quickly that her head spun, her hands still sticky with preserves. "I would never," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Patterson, I swear to you I haven't taken anything. I wouldn't." "The evidence suggests otherwise," Patterson said, crossing his arms over his broad chest. $20 missing from the cash box, discrepancies in the inventory records you were supposed to be keeping, and now this convenient accident that destroys expensive merchandise. "It all adds up, Miss Crawford." "But I didn't do any of those things," Natalie protested, feeling panic rising in her chest like floodwater. "The cash box, I never even touched it except when you were here. And the inventory, I recorded everything exactly as you told me to." "Please, you have to believe me." "What I believe is that I've been too trusting," Patterson said, his voice growing harder. "I took you on without references, gave you a chance when no one else in this town would, and this is how you repay me." The door to the store opened, and Natalie's heart sank even further as Sheriff Thomas Buckley stepped inside, followed by 2 other men from town. News traveled fast in Snowflake, and it seemed Patterson had already made up his mind about her guilt before even confronting her. "Marcus," the sheriff said, nodding to Patterson before his eyes settled on Natalie. "What seems to be the problem here?" "I have a thief working for me, Thomas," Patterson said, his voice carrying through the store with enough volume that anyone passing by on the street could hear. "This girl has been stealing from me for weeks, and I want her arrested." "That's not true," Natalie said desperately, looking from the sheriff to the growing crowd that was gathering in the doorway. "Sheriff, please, I haven't stolen anything. I wouldn't." Sheriff Buckley was a tall, weathered man with gray in his mustache and eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled, but he also had a reputation for believing property owners over drifters and newcomers. "That's a serious accusation, Marcus," he said carefully. "What evidence do you have?" $20 missing from my cash box, inventory discrepancies, and her own suspicious behavior," Patterson said, ticking off the items on his fingers. "She's been jumpy and nervous all week, probably because she knew I was getting close to discovering her theft." "I've been nervous because you've been accusing me of things I didn't do," Natalie said, her voice breaking. "Please, someone has to believe me. I need this job. I would never jeopardize it by stealing." "That's exactly what someone who needs money would do," Patterson said dismissively. "You came to this town with nothing, no family, no references, no explanation of where you came from or why. For all we know, you've done this before in other towns." Natalie felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't show weakness now, couldn't give them any more ammunition to use against her. "I came here because I needed a fresh start," she said quietly. "I've worked hard every single day, and I've never taken so much as a penny that wasn't mine. If money is missing, then someone else took it, but it wasn't me." "Sheriff, I want her arrested," Patterson said firmly. "I want my money back, and I want her prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Sheriff Buckley sighed and reached for the handcuffs at his belt. "Miss Crawford, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me while we sort this out." "No," Natalie said, backing away. "No, I didn't do anything wrong. You can't arrest me for something I didn't do." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the sheriff said, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation either. "You'll have a chance to tell your side of things." "My side won't matter," Natalie said bitterly. "No one in this town knows me, and Mr. Patterson is respected. Who's going to believe a woman with no family and no connections over an established merchant?" Before the sheriff could respond, a new voice cut through the tension in the store. "I believe her." Everyone turned to look at the man who had just stepped through the doorway, and Natalie's breath caught in her throat. She'd seen him around town a few times over the past weeks, always from a distance, always moving with a quiet confidence that set him apart from the other men in Snowflake. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, faded denim and a worn leather vest, with a bandana tied loosely around his neck. There was dust on his boots and sun-weathered lines at the corners of his eyes, but it was his expression that caught Natalie's attention. He looked absolutely certain, as if he'd just stated an indisputable fact rather than an opinion. "This doesn't concern you, Samuel," Sheriff Buckley said with a hint of warning in his voice. "I'm making it my concern," the cowboy said, his eyes never leaving Natalie's face. "I know you're not a thief." The words hung in the air like a benediction, and Natalie felt something shift in her chest. She'd never spoken to this man before, didn't even know his full name beyond what the sheriff had just revealed, but he was standing there defending her when everyone else in town had already condemned her. "And how would you know that, Samuel Nolan?" Patterson demanded. "You barely know the girl." "I know enough," Samuel said calmly, finally tearing his gaze away from Natalie to look at Patterson. "I've been watching and I've seen things that don't add up with your accusations." "What things?" the sheriff asked, and Natalie could hear the skepticism in his voice. Samuel stepped further into the store, and the crowd parted to let him through. He moved with an easy grace that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin, unafraid of the attention he was drawing. "I've been bringing supplies to my family's ranch from this store for the past month," he said. "I've seen how Miss Crawford handles the merchandise, how careful she is with the cash box, how thoroughly she records every transaction. She's not sloppy, and she's not dishonest." "That doesn't prove anything," Patterson said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. "No, but this might," Samuel said, pulling a small notebook from his vest pocket. "I've been keeping my own records of every purchase I've made here, including the exact change I received. 3 times in the past 2 weeks, I received less change than I should have, but Miss Crawford wasn't working those days. Your nephew was." A murmur went through the crowd, and Natalie saw Patterson's face go red. "My nephew has nothing to do with this," he said quickly, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "Your nephew Robert works here 2 days a week," Samuel continued relentlessly. "The same 2 days when money has gone missing from your cash box. The same days when inventory has mysteriously disappeared from your stockroom. Miss Crawford works the other 5 days, and I'm willing to bet that if you check your records carefully, you'll find that nothing went missing on the days she worked alone." The sheriff's expression had changed from skepticism to interest. "Is that true, Marcus? Does the timeline match up?" Patterson opened his mouth, then closed it again. Natalie watched as he mentally reviewed the past few weeks, and she could see the exact moment when doubt crept into his eyes. I'd have to check the exact dates," he said slowly. "I suggest you do that," Samuel said. "And while you're at it, you might want to ask your nephew where he was yesterday afternoon when $20 went missing from your cash box. Because I saw him riding out of town heading toward the saloon in Apache Springs, and a man doesn't ride 10 miles to a saloon unless he's got money burning a hole in his pocket." "Robert said he was at home yesterday," Patterson said, but he sounded uncertain now. "Then either he lied to you or I'm mistaken about what I saw," Samuel said. "But I'm not mistaken. I know your nephew, Marcus, and I know his horse. It was him." Sheriff Buckley cleared his throat. "Seems like we've got some conflicting information here," he said carefully. "Marcus, before we go arresting anyone, maybe we should investigate this a bit more thoroughly. Talk to your nephew, check those dates against your records, see if Mr. Nolan's timeline holds up." Patterson looked from the sheriff to Samuel to Natalie, and she could see him struggling with the realization that he might have been wrong. "Yes, perhaps that would be wise," he said stiffly. "But until this is resolved, Miss Crawford, I'm suspending you from your position." It wasn't as bad as being arrested, but it was still a crushing blow. Without her job, Natalie had no income, and without income, she couldn't pay for her room at the boarding house. She'd be homeless within a week. "I understand," she said quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "She can stay at the ranch," Samuel said suddenly, and everyone's heads whipped around to stare at him. "My mother needs help with the housework, and we've got a spare room. Miss Crawford can work for us until this situation is resolved and her name is cleared." Natalie felt her jaw drop. I couldn't possibly," she stammered. "Why not?" Samuel asked, finally turning those whiskey-colored eyes back on her. "You need work, we need help, and this way you'll have a roof over your head and witnesses who can vouch for your character. Seems like a practical solution to me." "But you don't know me," Natalie protested. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Something flickered across Samuel's face, an expression too complex to name. "Because I know what it's like to be accused of something you didn't do," he said quietly. "And because when I look at you, I see honesty, not deception. That's enough for me." The sheriff looked between them, then shrugged. "Well, if the Nolan family is willing to take responsibility for her, I don't see any harm in it. Marcus, you let me know once you've checked those records and talked to your nephew. Miss Crawford, you stay out of trouble and stay where we can find you if we need to ask more questions." "Yes, sir," Natalie said, still reeling from the sudden turn of events. 10 minutes ago, she'd been facing arrest and imprisonment, and now she was being offered sanctuary by a man she'd never even spoken to before. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that there wouldn't be any dramatic arrest to gossip about over supper. Patterson retreated to his back room without another word, his face still red with embarrassment and confusion. The sheriff touched his hat brim in farewell and headed back out into the blazing Arizona sunshine. When they were alone, Samuel turned to Natalie with a slight smile. "You should probably clean up and get your things from the boarding house," he said. "The ranch is about an hour's ride from town, and we should head out before it gets any hotter." "Mr. Nolan," Natalie said, and her voice was shaking now that the immediate crisis had passed. "I don't know how to thank you. What you did just now, standing up for me when no one else would, I'll never forget it." "Samuel," he corrected gently, "and you don't need to thank me. I just told the truth as I saw it." "But you barely know me," Natalie said. "How could you be so certain I wasn't guilty?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft but absolutely certain. "I've been coming to this store for a month now, and every time I did, I watched you. The way you treat customers with respect, even when they're rude to you. The way you take extra care with the merchandise, making sure nothing gets damaged. The way your hands shake a little when you count back change, like you're terrified of making a mistake. That's not the behavior of a thief, Miss Crawford. That's the behavior of someone who desperately needs to hold onto the one good thing in her life." Natalie felt tears welling up again, but this time she let them fall. "I did need this job desperately," she admitted. "After my parents died last year, I had nothing left in Kansas. I came west hoping to start over, hoping to build a life for myself. This job was everything to me. Then we'll make sure your name gets cleared, and you can go back to building that life," Samuel said firmly. "But in the meantime, you'll have work at the ranch and you'll have people who believe in you. That's not nothing." "It's everything," Natalie whispered. Samuel held her gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. Then he cleared his throat and stepped back, giving her space. "Go get your things," he said. "I'll wait for you out front with the horses." Natalie nodded and hurried toward the back of the store where she'd left her personal belongings. As she gathered her apron and her small lunch pail, she couldn't help but glance back at the tall cowboy standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright Arizona sun. She didn't know what twist of fate had brought Samuel Nolan into the store at exactly the right moment, but she was profoundly grateful for it. For the first time since the jar had shattered on the floor, she felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. The ride to the Nolan ranch was longer than Samuel had suggested, mainly because Natalie had never been particularly good with horses, and he'd had to adjust his pace to accommodate her inexperience. He'd borrowed a gentle mare from the livery stable for her to ride, and he'd been patient and encouraging as she struggled to find her seat and get comfortable with the rhythm of the animal's gait. "You're doing fine," Samuel called back to her as they followed a dusty trail that wound through scrubland dotted with juniper trees and prickly pear cactus. "Just relax and let the horse do the work." "Easy for you to say," Natalie muttered, but she tried to follow his advice, loosening her death grip on the reins and trying to move with the horse instead of against it. The afternoon heat was oppressive, and she could feel sweat trickling down her spine beneath her dress, but there was something almost beautiful about the harsh landscape around them. The sky was a brilliant blue, unmarred by clouds, and in the distance she could see red rock formations rising from the earth like ancient monuments. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked, partly because she was curious and partly because talking helped distract her from her nervousness about the horse. "My whole life," Samuel said, and there was something in his voice that suggested both pride and resignation. "My father came to Arizona Territory back in '73 when there wasn't much out here but Mormons and Apaches and a whole lot of empty space. He started the ranch with nothing but a land claim and a dream, built it up from nothing." "That must have been difficult," Natalie said. "It was," Samuel agreed. "Those early years were hard on everyone, especially my mother. She came from a good family back in Missouri, wasn't used to the rough life out here. But she adapted, became stronger than most men I know. My father always said she was the real backbone of the ranch." Natalie heard the past tense and winced. "Your father isn't with you anymore. He died 3 years ago," Samuel said, his voice carefully neutral. "Apache raid. He was helping some neighbors bring in their cattle when a war party came through. He tried to protect the others, bought them time to get to safety, but he didn't make it out himself." "I'm so sorry," Natalie said softly, understanding his pain all too well. "It's hard losing a parent. Losing both of mine at once, I thought I'd never breathe properly again." Samuel glanced back at her, and in that moment, she saw recognition in his eyes, the acknowledgement of shared grief. "It gets easier," he said. "Not better exactly, but easier. You learn to carry it." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and Natalie found herself studying the man riding ahead of her. There was something inherently decent about Samuel Nolan, something that showed in the straight line of his shoulders and the gentle way he handled his horse. He'd stood up for her in front of the whole town without knowing anything about her beyond his own observations, had offered her a place to stay when she had nowhere to go. That kind of fundamental goodness was rare, especially in the rough frontier towns of the Arizona Territory. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Of course. Why were you at the store today? It seemed like you arrived at exactly the right moment, almost like fate." Samuel was quiet for so long that Natalie thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I'd been planning to come to town for supplies anyway," he said. "But I'll admit, I might have hurried the trip along when I saw Patterson's nephew riding out of town yesterday with money to burn. I had a feeling something wasn't right, and I didn't want you to take the fall for his mistakes." "So you were watching out for me," Natalie said, surprised and touched. "I suppose I was," Samuel admitted. "Like I said, I've been noticing you, the way you work, the way you are. I didn't want to see you get hurt." There was something in his tone that made Natalie's heart skip a beat, but before she could analyze the feeling, the ranch came into view over a rise, and Samuel was pointing ahead. "There it is," he said. "Home." The Nolan ranch was more substantial than Natalie had expected. The main house was a low, adobe structure with a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides, offering shade from the relentless sun. There were several outbuildings, a barn, corrals, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on scrubland that somehow managed to support them. It wasn't grand by any means, but it was solid and well-maintained, a testament to the hard work of the family who'd built it. As they rode into the yard, a woman emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the sun. She was in her early 50s, Natalie guessed, with dark hair showing threads of silver and a face that had once been beautiful and still held traces of that beauty, despite the harsh life she'd lived. She wore a simple calico dress and an apron, and her expression was one of surprise as she took in Natalie riding beside her son. "Samuel," she called out, "I wasn't expecting you back so soon, and who's this you've brought with you?" Samuel dismounted with easy grace and moved to help Natalie down from her horse. His hands were gentle but strong as they circled her waist, lifting her down as if she weighed nothing. For just a moment they stood close together, and Natalie could smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to him. Then he stepped back, and she could breathe again. "Mother, this is Miss Natalie Crawford," Samuel said, leading Natalie toward the porch. "She's the young woman I told you about who works at Patterson's store. There's been some trouble in town, and she needs a place to stay for a while." The woman's expression shifted from surprise to concern, and she came down the porch steps to meet them. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, looking Natalie over with sharp, assessing eyes. "Patterson accused her of stealing," Samuel said bluntly. "But he's wrong. His nephew Robert is the real thief, and I've got evidence to prove it. I told Miss Crawford she could stay here and work for us while the situation gets sorted out." His mother's eyebrows rose. "You did you? And you didn't think to discuss this with me first?" "I knew you'd agree," Samuel said with a slight smile. "You're always saying you need help with the housework, especially now that your hip has been bothering you." "My hip is fine," his mother said automatically, but Natalie noticed the way she shifted her weight slightly, as if standing for too long caused discomfort. Then the older woman's expression softened as she looked at Natalie. "But Samuel is right. We could use an extra pair of hands around here. And if my son says you're innocent, then I believe him. He's a good judge of character." "Thank you, Mrs. Nolan," Natalie said gratefully. "I promise I'll work hard and earn my keep. I won't be a burden to you." "Martha," the woman corrected, "we don't stand on formality out here." "And you won't be a burden, dear. Any friend of Samuel's is welcome in this house." "I wouldn't say we're friends exactly," Natalie said carefully, not wanting to misrepresent their relationship. "We've never actually spoken before today." Martha looked from Natalie to her son, and something knowing flickered across her face. "Is that so?" she said mildly. "Well, you're speaking now, and that's what matters. Come inside, both of you. You must be parched after that ride." "Natalie, I'll show you to your room, and then we can talk about what needs doing around here." The inside of the ranch house was surprisingly cool, the thick adobe walls keeping out the worst of the heat. The main room was spacious and simply furnished, with a large fireplace at one end, a worn but comfortable-looking sofa and chairs, and a table that could seat 6. Everything was clean and well cared for, but Natalie could see signs of deferred maintenance, little things that suggested the household was stretched thin. A loose board in the floor, curtains that needed mending, windows that could use a good cleaning. Martha led her down a short hallway to a small bedroom at the back of the house. It was simply furnished with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand, but the window looked out on a view of the distant red rocks, and there were clean sheets on the bed and a colorful quilt folded at the foot. "It's not fancy," Martha said, "but it's private and it's yours for as long as you need it." "It's perfect," Natalie said honestly. After 6 months of living in a cramped room at the boarding house with paper-thin walls and dubious cleanliness, this felt like a palace. "Thank you so much, Martha. I don't know what I would have done if Samuel hadn't spoken up for me today." Martha sat down on the edge of the bed, wincing slightly as she did. "My son has a strong sense of justice," she said. "It's gotten him into trouble more than once, standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. But I wouldn't want him any other way." "He told me about your husband," Natalie said softly. "I'm sorry for your loss." Martha's expression grew distant. "James was a good man," she said. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery, but good. He built this ranch with his own 2 hands, raised his children to value hard work and honesty. Samuel is very much like him in that way." "You have other children." "A daughter, Rebecca," Martha said. "She married a rancher from up near Prescott 2 years ago. I don't see her as often as I'd like, but she's happy, and that's what matters. It's just Samuel and me now, rattling around in this house trying to keep the ranch going." "It must be difficult," Natalie said. "It is," Martha admitted, "but we manage. Samuel works harder than any two men, and I do what I can. Having you here will help, though. There's always more to do than there are hours in the day." They talked for a while longer, Martha explaining the routine of the household and what would be expected of Natalie. The work wasn't particularly difficult, mostly cooking and cleaning and mending, with occasional help in the vegetable garden Martha maintained behind the house. In return, Natalie would receive room and board and a small wage, enough to save up a little money for when she could return to town. When Martha finally left her alone to settle in, Natalie sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the full weight of everything that had happened that day. This morning, she'd woken up thinking it would be just another ordinary day at the store. Now, her reputation was in tatters, she'd lost her job, and she was living on a ranch with people who were little more than strangers. But when she thought about Samuel standing up for her in front of everyone, his voice firm and certain as he said, "I know you're not a thief," she felt something warm unfurling in her chest. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm that surprised Natalie with its ease. She woke early each morning to help Martha prepare breakfast for Samuel and the 3 ranch hands who worked for them. The men were respectful and friendly, middle-aged cowboys who'd worked for James Nolan and stayed on after his death out of loyalty to the family. They treated Natalie with casual courtesy, accepting her presence without question since Samuel had vouched for her. After breakfast, while Samuel and the hands rode out to work with the cattle, Natalie would tackle the household chores. She cleaned and mended, washed clothes in the big copper tub behind the house, tended the vegetable garden, and helped Martha with the endless task of preparing meals for hungry men who worked hard in the brutal Arizona heat. It was exhausting work, but it was also satisfying in a way her job at the store had never been. Here, she could see the direct results of her labor. The house grew cleaner and more organized, the mending pile shrank, the garden flourished under her careful attention. Martha's hip seemed to bother her less when she didn't have to spend all day on her feet, and the older woman's gratitude was evident in her warm smiles and kind words. But what Natalie found herself looking forward to most were the evenings, when Samuel would return from the range, dusty and tired but always with a smile for her. They'd taken to sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sun set over the red rocks in the distance, talking about everything and nothing. "Tell me about Kansas," Samuel said one evening, about a week after she'd arrived at the ranch. They were sitting in comfortable silence, rocking chairs creaking gently, the air finally starting to cool after another scorching day. Natalie was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "It was different from here," she said finally. "Greener, wetter. We had a small farm outside of Topeka, nothing fancy, but it was home. My father grew wheat and corn, kept a few animals. My mother had a beautiful flower garden that she tended like it was her pride and joy." "Sounds nice," Samuel said. "It was," Natalie agreed, "until the fever came through. It took them both within a week of each other. I tried to keep the farm going, but I didn't know enough about the business side of things. My father had always handled that. Within 6 months, the bank foreclosed, and I had nothing left but the clothes on my back and enough money for a train ticket west." "Why Arizona?" Samuel asked. Natalie smiled ruefully. "Why not? I'd heard there were opportunities out here for people willing to work hard. I didn't have any ties anywhere else, no family, no prospects. I figured the frontier was as good a place as any to start over." "And has it been?" Samuel asked. "A good place to start over," Natalie thought about the question carefully. It's been harder than I expected, she admitted. People out here don't trust easily, especially not single women with no connections. Before Patterson hired me, I'd been turned away from a dozen other jobs. And now, with this accusation hanging over my head, I don't know if I'll ever be able to build a life in Snowflake. You will, Samuel said with quiet certainty. Patterson will figure out the truth about his nephew, your name will be cleared, and people will forget all about it. Give it time. I hope you're right, Natalie said, but she couldn't quite keep the doubt out of her voice. Samuel turned to look at her, his expression serious in the fading light. Even if Patterson never admits he was wrong, even if the whole town believes you're guilty, you'll still have a place here. You know that, right? Natalie's breath caught. Samuel, I can't impose on your hospitality forever. It's not imposing if you're wanted, Samuel said simply. My mother adores you, the ranch runs smoother with your help, and I. He trailed off, looking suddenly uncertain, as if he'd been about to say something important and thought better of it. And you what? Natalie prompted, her heart beating faster. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, then he stood up and moved to lean against the porch railing, his back to the sunset. And I enjoy having you here, he said finally. These past few days, coming home in the evening and knowing you'll be here, it's been nice. The house feels different, warmer somehow. I look forward to these conversations, to hearing your thoughts about things, to making you laugh when you forget to be sad for a while. Natalie felt her cheeks flush, and she was grateful for the dimming light that might hide her reaction. I enjoy it too, she admitted softly. I enjoy talking with you, learning about the ranch, about your life. You're a good man, Samuel Nolan. I don't think I've properly thanked you for everything you've done for me. You thank me every day just by being here, Samuel said, and there was something in his voice that made Natalie's pulse race. I meant what I said in town, Natalie. When I look at you, I see honesty and strength and a kind of quiet courage that most people don't have. You've been through hell this past year, but you're still standing, still trying, still hoping for better days. That's not nothing. It doesn't feel like courage, Natalie said. Most days it just feels like stubbornness, like I'm too foolish to know when to give up. That's exactly what courage is, Samuel said with a slight smile. Keeping going even when giving up would be easier. My father used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when things are easy, it's what they do when everything falls apart. By that measure, you're one of the strongest people I know. Natalie stood up and moved to join him at the railing, looking out at the darkening landscape. You barely know me, she said, echoing the words she'd spoken to him that first day in the store. I know enough, Samuel said, just as he had then. And every day I learn more, and every day I like what I learn. They stood there in the gathering darkness, close enough that Natalie could feel the warmth radiating from him, could hear the soft sound of his breathing. She wanted to turn to him, wanted to see if the expression in his eyes matched the one she suspected was in her own, but she was afraid. Afraid of misreading the situation, afraid of ruining the fragile connection that was forming between them, afraid of getting hurt again just when she was starting to feel safe. I should go help Martha with the dishes, she said finally, breaking the moment. Of course, Samuel said, stepping back to give her space. But as she moved toward the door, his hand caught hers, just for a moment, just long enough for his thumb to brush across her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. Good night, Natalie. Good night, Samuel, she whispered, and hurried inside before he could see the tears that were suddenly threatening to fall. That night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her, Natalie let herself acknowledge what had been growing in her heart for the past week. She was falling for Samuel Nolan. It was foolish and impractical and probably doomed to end in heartbreak, but it was happening nonetheless. Every time he smiled at her, every time he spoke her name in that low, warm voice, every time he looked at her like she was something precious and worth protecting, she fell a little bit more. The problem was, she had no idea if he felt the same way. He was kind to her, certainly, and he seemed to enjoy her company, but that didn't necessarily mean anything beyond friendship. He was a good man helping someone in need, nothing more. She couldn't let herself read too much into his words or his gestures, couldn't let herself hope for something that might not be there. But when she finally drifted off to sleep, it was with the memory of his hand on hers and the sound of his voice saying her name like a prayer. 2 weeks after Natalie arrived at the ranch, Samuel returned from town with news. She was in the kitchen helping Martha prepare supper when she heard his horse in the yard, earlier than usual. She looked out the window and felt her stomach clench when she saw the expression on his face. "What is it?" she asked as soon as he came through the door. "What's happened?" Samuel pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, looking troubled. "I talked to Sheriff Buckley," he said. "Patterson finally checked his records and confirmed what I'd suspected. The money went missing on days when his nephew was working, not when you were there." "That's good news," Natalie said, confused by his grim expression. "Isn't it?" "It would be, except Patterson is refusing to admit he was wrong," Samuel said angrily. "He claims the evidence is circumstantial, says his nephew denied taking anything. He's convinced the sheriff not to press charges against Robert, and he's not willing to clear your name publicly." Natalie felt the room tilt. "So I'm still accused of being a thief," she said numbly. "Even though everyone knows I didn't do it." "Not everyone believes it," Samuel said quickly. "The sheriff knows the truth, and so do several other people in town who have been watching the situation. But Patterson has influence, and he doesn't want to admit he was wrong about you." "Because that would mean admitting his nephew is a thief," Martha said quietly from the stove. "And that would damage the family's reputation." "Exactly," Samuel said. "He'd rather let you take the blame than deal with the scandal of having a thief in his own family." Natalie sat down heavily at the kitchen table, feeling like all the air had gone out of her lungs. "So what do I do?" she asked. "I can't go back to work for him, even if he'd have me. And no one else in town will hire me with this cloud over my head. I'll never be able to clear my name." Samuel crossed the room and crouched down in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. "You don't need to clear your name," he said firmly. "You know the truth. I know the truth, and that's what matters. You stay here, you work for us, and eventually people will forget all about Patterson's accusations." "But it's not fair," Natalie said, and her voice broke on the last word. "I didn't do anything wrong, and I'm the one being punished for it." "Life's not fair," Samuel said gently. "But that doesn't mean you let it break you. You keep going, you keep your head up, and you prove by your actions what kind of person you are. The people who matter will see the truth." Natalie looked into his eyes and saw absolute conviction there, saw his belief in her shining like a beacon. "You really believe that, don't you?" she whispered. "I do," Samuel said, "and I need you to believe it too." Martha came over and placed a hand on Natalie's shoulder. "Samuel's right, dear," she said. "I know it hurts and I know it's unjust, but you can't let Patterson's cowardice define you. You're stronger than that." Natalie drew in a shaky breath and nodded. "I'll try," she said. "But it's hard, knowing that people think I'm a thief when I've never stolen anything in my life." "Then we'll just have to change their minds," Samuel said. "Starting with making sure everyone in town knows exactly what I saw and what the records show. Patterson may not be willing to clear your name officially, but I'm not bound by his wishes. I'll tell anyone who will listen the truth about what happened." "Samuel, you don't have to do that," Natalie protested. You've already done so much for me." "I want to," Samuel said simply. "You deserve to have someone fighting for you, Natalie, and I intend to do exactly that." He stood up, still holding her hands, and pulled her gently to her feet. They stood there for a moment, close enough that Natalie could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the calluses on his palms where they pressed against hers. She wanted to tell him what his support meant to her, wanted to find the words to express the gratitude and affection and growing love that filled her chest until she could barely breathe. But Martha was watching with undisguised interest, and Natalie couldn't quite bring herself to be that vulnerable in front of an audience. "Thank you," she said instead, squeezing his hands, "for everything." Samuel smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him look younger and almost boyish. "You're welcome," he said. "Now let's eat supper before it gets cold. I'm starving, and whatever you two have been cooking smells delicious." The meal was quieter than usual, everyone lost in their own thoughts. But afterward, when Samuel suggested they take their usual evening walk around the property, Natalie agreed eagerly, grateful for the chance to talk to him alone. They walked in silence for a while, following a path that led away from the house toward a small creek that ran along the edge of the property. The evening air was finally starting to cool, and overhead, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I'm sorry about what Patterson did," Samuel said finally. "I really thought he'd do the right thing once he saw the evidence." "You give people the benefit of the doubt," Natalie said. "It's one of the things I admire about you, but not everyone deserves that benefit." Samuel glanced at her. "There are things you admire about me?" he asked, and there was a note of pleased surprise in his voice. Natalie felt her cheeks heat. "Of course there are," she said. "You're honest and hardworking and kind. You stand up for what's right, even when it would be easier not to. You took in a stranger based on nothing but your instinct that she was telling the truth. How could I not admire that?" They had reached the creek, and Samuel stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and shadow, and in that light he looked almost otherworldly, like something out of a dream. "Natalie," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like music. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." "Can you do that?" Natalie's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "Yes," she whispered. Samuel took a deep breath. "When I first saw you in Patterson's store, it was like something clicked into place in my chest. I couldn't explain it then, and I'm not sure I can explain it now, but I knew. I knew you were important, that you were going to matter to me. I started finding excuses to come to town more often, just so I could see you, watch the way you interacted with customers, listen to your voice as you tallied up purchases. My mother started teasing me about how much time I was spending at the store when we didn't really need half the supplies I was buying." He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Natalie was coming to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "When I saw what was happening that day, when I heard Patterson accusing you, I didn't even think. I just knew I had to defend you, had to make sure you were safe. And when I brought you here, I told myself it was just because it was the right thing to do, because you needed help and I could provide it. But these past few weeks, having you here, talking to you every evening, seeing your smile when something makes you happy, I've realized the truth. I have feelings for you, Natalie, strong feelings. The kind that keep me awake at night and make it hard to focus on work during the day because I'm too busy thinking about you." Natalie's breath caught in her throat, but she remembered her promise to let him finish, so she stayed silent. "I know the timing is terrible," Samuel continued. "I know you're dealing with so much right now, and the last thing you probably need is a cowboy declaring himself like some character in a dime novel, but I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I needed you to know that you're not alone, that you have someone in your corner who cares about you deeply. Not just as a friend or someone I'm helping out of obligation, but as a woman I'm coming to love." The last word hung in the air between them, and Natalie felt tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. "Samuel," she said, and her voice was shaking. "Can I talk now?" He nodded, looking uncertain as if he was bracing himself for rejection. "I'm falling in love with you too," Natalie said, and watched joy spread across his face like sunrise. "I've been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was just gratitude or the intensity of the situation, but I can't deny it anymore. When I'm with you, I feel safe and valued and seen in a way I've never felt before. You make me laugh, you make me think, you make me want to be brave enough to hope for a future I thought I'd lost. I don't know what's going to happen with Patterson or the town or my reputation, but I know that I want you in my life, however that works out." Samuel closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Because once you say yes to this to us, I'm not going to let you go easily. I'm going to fight for you, for us, for whatever future we can build together." "I'm sure," Natalie said. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Samuel's smile was brilliant, and then he was lowering his head, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to. But pulling away was the last thing Natalie wanted. She rose up on her toes to meet him, and when their lips finally touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking the fragile magic of the moment. But then Samuel's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and Natalie's hands slid up to tangle in his hair, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and promise and the beginning of something beautiful. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I wish you had," Natalie said with a shaky laugh. "Would have saved me a lot of sleepless nights wondering if you felt the same way." "I do," Samuel said firmly. "I feel exactly the same way, and I'm going to spend every day proving it to you if you'll let me." "I'll let you," Natalie said and kissed him again, softer this time, sweeter. When they finally started walking back toward the house, their hands were intertwined, their steps matched. 2 people who had found each other against all odds in the harsh Arizona territory. Martha was waiting on the porch when they returned, and the knowing smile on her face suggested she'd guessed exactly what had transpired by the creek. "About time," she said as they climbed the steps. "I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other forever. You knew?" Natalie asked, embarrassed and pleased in equal measure. "Of course I knew," Martha said. "I'm not blind, dear. Samuel's been mooning over you since the day he brought you home, and you light up like a lantern whenever he walks into a room. It was only a matter of time before one of you worked up the courage to say something." Samuel laughed and pulled Natalie closer to his side. "Well, we've said something now," he told his mother. "And I hope you're prepared for Natalie to be staying here permanently, because I'm not letting her go." "Permanently," Natalie repeated, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Too soon?" Samuel asked, suddenly uncertain again. "No," Natalie said quickly. "Not too soon. Just surprising. We've only just admitted our feelings and you're already talking about forever." "When you know," Samuel said simply. "And I know. But if you need time, I'll wait. I'll wait as long as you need." Natalie looked from Samuel to Martha, seeing only warmth and acceptance in both their faces. For the first time since her parents died, she felt like she had a family again, felt like she belonged somewhere. "I don't need time," she said. "I know too. But let's take things one step at a time, shall we? We've got a whole future ahead of us to figure out the details." "One step at a time," Samuel agreed, and kissed her forehead gently. "Starting with clearing your name so you can hold your head up in town again." Over the following weeks, Samuel was true to his word. He made a point of going into Snowflake regularly and telling anyone who would listen exactly what he'd witnessed, what the records showed, and how Patterson was protecting his nephew at Natalie's expense. Some people dismissed his claims, loyal to Patterson's long-standing reputation in town. But others listened, and slowly, grudgingly, public opinion began to shift. The sheriff helped, mentioning to various townspeople that his own investigation had confirmed Samuel's timeline, and that while he couldn't formally charge Robert Patterson without Marcus Patterson's cooperation, he personally believed Natalie was innocent. The minister's wife spoke up at a church social, noting that she'd always found Natalie to be a polite and honest young woman. The elderly couple who ran the boarding house where Natalie had lived mentioned that she'd never been late with her rent and had always been respectful and responsible. It was a slow process, like water wearing away stone, but gradually the accusations against Natalie began to lose their power. People stopped whispering when she came to town with Samuel for supplies. Women who had previously snubbed her began nodding politely when they passed on the street. The general consensus seemed to be shifting toward the idea that perhaps Marcus Patterson had been too hasty in his judgment, and perhaps young Robert wasn't quite as trustworthy as his uncle believed. Through it all, Natalie and Samuel's relationship deepened and strengthened. They worked side by side on the ranch, rode out together to check on cattle, spent long evenings talking about their hopes and dreams for the future. Samuel was courting her properly, with all the respect and care that Martha insisted was appropriate, but there was no doubt in anyone's mind that they were deeply in love. One evening, about 2 months after Natalie had first arrived at the ranch, Samuel asked her to take a walk with him after supper. They followed their usual path to the creek, but this time Samuel seemed nervous, his hand gripping hers a little tighter than usual. "Is something wrong?" Natalie asked, concerned. "No," Samuel said quickly. "Nothing's wrong. In fact, everything's right. Maybe for the first time in years, everything feels exactly as it should be." They reached the creek, and Samuel stopped in the same spot where they'd first kissed. The memory hung in the air between them, sweet and powerful. "Natalie," Samuel said, turning to face her and taking both her hands in his. "These past 2 months have been the happiest of my life. Waking up knowing you're here, working alongside you during the day, talking with you in the evenings, it's been everything I never knew I was missing. You've brought joy and light and laughter back into this house, back into my life. I can't imagine going back to the way things were before you came." "I feel the same way," Natalie said softly. "I came to Arizona hoping for a fresh start, and I found so much more. I found a home, a purpose in you, especially you." Samuel took a deep breath, and to Natalie's surprise, he lowered himself onto one knee, still holding her hands. "Then make it official," he said. "Marry me, Natalie. Be my wife, my partner, the mother of my children if we're blessed with them. Help me run this ranch and build a future together. I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you just how much." Natalie felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of pure joy. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, of course I'll marry you. I love you too, Samuel. So much it scares me sometimes." Samuel surged to his feet and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until they were both laughing and crying and kissing all at once. When he finally set her back on her feet, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring. "It was my grandmother's," he explained as he slid it onto her finger. My father gave it to my mother when they got engaged, and she gave it to me last week and told me it was time to give it to the woman I plan to marry. It fits you perfectly. Natalie looked down at the ring, gleaming softly in the moonlight, and felt overwhelming gratitude for the chain of circumstances that had brought her to this moment. If Patterson hadn't falsely accused her, if Samuel hadn't stood up for her, if she hadn't come to the ranch, she never would have found this happiness. "When should we get married?" she asked, looking up at Samuel with shining eyes. "As soon as possible," Samuel said. "Tomorrow, if the minister is available. I don't want to wait any longer than necessary to make you my wife." Natalie laughed. "Your mother will kill you if we don't give her time to plan a proper wedding. How about a month from now? That should give us time to do it right." "A month," Samuel groaned. "That's an eternity." "It'll go by faster than you think," Natalie promised. "And it'll give me time to make a proper dress and your mother time to invite people and us time to prepare the house for our life together." "Our life together," Samuel repeated, and the words sounded like a vow. "I like the sound of that." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and Martha took one look at their faces and burst into tears of happiness. "Finally," she said, pulling them both into a fierce hug. "I was beginning to think Samuel would never work up the courage to ask properly." "I had to wait for the right moment," Samuel protested. "Every moment with Natalie is the right moment," Martha said, wiping her eyes. "Oh, we have so much to do. A wedding to plan, people to invite, food to prepare." "Natalie, dear, do you have anyone you want to invite? Family, friends from Kansas?" Natalie's smile faltered slightly. "No," she said quietly. "Everyone I cared about is gone, but that's all right. You and Samuel are my family now, and that's enough." Martha's expression softened. "Then we'll make sure this wedding is perfect for you," she said. "A celebration of new beginnings and the family you've found here with us." The next month passed in a whirlwind of activity. Word spread through Snowflake that Samuel Nolan was marrying Natalie Crawford, and the news had an unexpected effect. People who had been on the fence about Natalie's innocence seemed to take Samuel's willingness to marry her as proof that she must be trustworthy after all. If a man as respected as Samuel Nolan was making her his wife, then clearly there was more to the story than Marcus Patterson had let on. Even Patterson himself seemed to soften slightly, though he never formally apologized or admitted he'd been wrong. But when Natalie came to town to buy fabric for her wedding dress, she found him at his store, and after an awkward moment, he gruffly offered his congratulations and gave her a discount on the material. "I may have been hasty in my judgment," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "The sheriff seems to think there were circumstances I didn't fully understand, and my nephew has proven to be less reliable than I believed. I wish you well, Miss Crawford." It wasn't a full apology, but it was close enough that Natalie felt a weight lift off her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson," she said graciously. "I appreciate that." As she left the store, she realized she no longer felt angry at Patterson. He was a flawed man who had made a mistake, protecting family at the expense of truth. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could choose to let go of the bitterness and move forward with her life. The wedding took place on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in late June. The ceremony was held at the small church in Snowflake, with nearly the whole town in attendance. Natalie wore a simple but elegant dress of cream-colored silk that she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers from Martha's garden woven into her dark hair. Samuel wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous and impossibly happy as he waited at the altar for his bride. As Natalie walked down the aisle on Martha's arm, since she had no father to give her away, she caught Samuel's eye and saw love shining there so brightly it took her breath away. This was real. This was happening. She was about to marry the man who had saved her, defended her, loved her when she had nothing to offer but herself. The ceremony was traditional but heartfelt, with the minister speaking about the bonds of marriage and the importance of trust and partnership. When it came time for the vows, Samuel took Natalie's hands in his and spoke clearly, his voice carrying through the small church. I, Samuel James Nolan, take you, Natalie Rose Crawford, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to stand by you in good times and bad, to defend you against any who would harm you, to work beside you to build a life and a future together. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. Natalie's voice shook slightly as she repeated her own vows, but the words came from her heart. I, Natalie Rose Crawford, take you, Samuel James Nolan, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand by you in good times and bad, to support you in your work and your dreams, to build a home filled with love and laughter. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed her gently, sweetly in front of everyone, and Natalie felt like her heart might burst from happiness. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food contributed by nearly every family in the area. There was music and dancing and laughter, and for one perfect afternoon, Natalie felt completely at peace. She was home, she was loved, and she had a future stretching out before her filled with possibility. As the sun began to set and the guests started to drift away, Samuel pulled Natalie into his arms for one last dance. They swayed together in the fading light, and he bent his head to whisper in her ear, "Happy, Mrs. Nolan." "Happier than I ever thought possible, Mr. Nolan," she whispered back. "Good," he said, "because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." They danced until the last guest had gone and the stars had come out overhead. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of loss and false accusations. It wasn't the life Natalie had planned when she left Kansas, but it was so much better than anything she could have imagined. The first year of their marriage was everything Natalie had hoped for and more. She and Samuel worked together to improve the ranch, adding new cattle, repairing outbuildings, and gradually making the property more prosperous. Martha's health improved with less work to do, and she delighted in teaching Natalie all the skills she'd need to eventually run the household on her own. Natalie also found herself becoming more involved in the community of Snowflake. With Samuel's support and her own determination, she started a small lending library out of their home, providing books to families who couldn't afford to buy their own. She organized socials for the women in the area, creating connections and friendships that enriched her life immeasurably. The shadow of Patterson's accusation faded almost entirely as people got to know the real Natalie, the woman who was kind and generous and hardworking. Robert Patterson eventually left town under mysterious circumstances, rumored to be running from gambling debts, and Marcus Patterson never spoke of the incident again. In the spring of 1884, 2 years after their wedding, Natalie gave Samuel the news he'd been hoping for. She was expecting their first child. Samuel's joy was so complete and overwhelming that he picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down again, worried that he might have hurt her or the baby. "I'm not made of glass," Natalie laughed, but she was touched by his concern. "You're carrying something precious," Samuel said, placing his hand gently over her still flat stomach. "Our child. I want to protect you both." "And you will," Natalie assured him. "You're going to be a wonderful father." The pregnancy was not easy. The Arizona heat was brutal during the summer months, and Natalie struggled with exhaustion and sickness, that seemed to last far longer than it should have. But Samuel was attentive and caring, adjusting his work schedule to be home more often, helping with tasks that had become too difficult for her, making sure she rested and ate properly. Martha was equally devoted, sharing wisdom from her own pregnancies and preparing everything they would need for the new baby. She sewed tiny clothes and knitted soft blankets, her hands always busy, her face glowing with excitement at the prospect of becoming a grandmother. On a cold January night in 1885, Natalie went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when Samuel, pacing outside the bedroom door while the midwife and his mother attended to Natalie, thought he might lose his mind from worry. But finally, as dawn was breaking over the red rocks in the distance, he heard the sound he'd been waiting for, the sharp, indignant cry of a newborn baby. The midwife opened the door with a smile. "You have a son," she said, "and your wife is tired but doing well. Come meet your boy." Samuel entered the bedroom on shaking legs and found Natalie propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in one of Martha's handmade blankets. She looked up as he approached, and her smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Say hello to your son," she said softly. Samuel sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making little snuffling sounds as he slept. "He's perfect," Samuel whispered, reaching out to touch one impossibly small hand. Immediately, tiny fingers curled around his own, gripping with surprising strength. "He's absolutely perfect. We need to name him," Natalie said. "Have you thought about what you'd like to call him?" Samuel had thought about little else for months. "James," he said, "after my father. James Crawford Nolan, carrying both our family names." Natalie's eyes filled with tears. "That's beautiful," she said. "Your father would be so proud." "He would be proud of you," Samuel said, leaning over to kiss her forehead gently. "You've given me everything I ever wanted and things I didn't even know I needed. A home filled with love, a partnership built on trust and respect, and now this beautiful boy. I love you, Natalie, more every day." "I love you too," Natalie said. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else would. Thank you for fighting for me, for defending me, for showing me what it means to be truly loved." "I'll always fight for you," Samuel promised. "You and James, you're my whole world now." Little James proved to be a healthy, happy baby who brought endless joy to the household. Martha doted on her grandson, and Samuel was a devoted father, involved in every aspect of his son's care in a way that was unusual for men of that time. He changed diapers and walked the floor with the baby when he cried at night, gave bottles when Natalie needed to rest, and could be found singing lullabies in his deep voice that somehow always soothed the baby to sleep. As James grew from an infant to a toddler, Natalie and Samuel's love only deepened. They had weathered challenges together, built a life from nothing, and created a family that was strong and loving. The ranch continued to prosper under their joint management, and they became respected members of the Snowflake community. In 1887, Natalie gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose Martha Nolan, after Natalie's middle name and Samuel's mother. Rose was as different from her brother as night from day, with light hair like her mother, and a sunny disposition that made everyone who met her smile. Martha lived long enough to see both her grandchildren walking and talking, to watch the ranch she and her husband had built continue to thrive under Samuel and Natalie's care. She passed away peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1888, content in the knowledge that her son was happy and well cared for, that the family legacy would continue. They buried her next to James in the small plot on a hill overlooking the ranch, And Samuel stood at the graveside with his arm around Natalie, James holding his other hand, and Rose in Natalie's arms, and felt profoundly grateful that his mother had lived to see him find happiness. The years continued to pass, marked by hard work and simple pleasures. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working with his father on the ranch. Rose was bright and curious, always asking questions and getting into harmless mischief. In 1890, they welcomed a third child, another son they named Thomas, and their family felt complete. Natalie sometimes thought back to that terrible day in Patterson's store, when her whole world had seemed to be falling apart. She thought about the fear and uncertainty, the feeling of being utterly alone. And then she thought about Samuel's voice cutting through the chaos, steady and certain. "I know you're not a thief." Those 7 words had changed everything, had set in motion a chain of events that led to this life, this family, this deep and abiding love. She'd lost so much when her parents died, had come west with nothing but hope and determination. But she'd found more than she'd ever dreamed possible. One evening, when the children were all asleep, and she and Samuel were sitting on the porch watching the sunset as they had done countless times over the years, she turned to him with a soft smile. "You remember that first day?" she asked. "When you stood up for me in Patterson's store?" "I remember everything about that day," Samuel said, pulling her closer to his side. "The way you looked so scared but so determined not to show it. The way your hands were shaking but your voice stayed steady. The moment I knew I couldn't let them arrest you for something you didn't do." "You barely knew me," Natalie said, not for the first time. It still amazed her, even after all these years. "I knew enough," Samuel said, as he always did. "And every day since then has proven I was right to trust my instincts. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Natalie. You and our children, you're everything." "You saved me," Natalie said softly. "Not just from being arrested, but from a life of loneliness and struggle. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love." "You saved me too," Samuel said, turning to cup her face in his hand. "I was just going through the motions before you came, working the ranch because it was what I was supposed to do, but not really living. You brought joy back into my life, gave me reasons to look forward to each new day. We saved each other." Natalie kissed him softly, a kiss that held years of love and partnership and shared experiences. "I'm glad you knew I wasn't a thief," she said with a smile. "I'm glad you gave me the chance to prove it," Samuel replied. They sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Inside the house, their children slept safely, surrounded by love. The ranch spread out around them, land they'd worked with their own hands, a legacy they would pass on to their children and their children's children. It wasn't the life Natalie had planned when she left Kansas, desperate and grieving. It was better. It was everything she'd ever wanted, and things she hadn't even known to wish for. A home, a family, a partner who believed in her even when the whole world seemed against her. As darkness fell and the stars came out overhead, Samuel took her hand and squeezed gently. "Ready to go inside, Mrs. Nolan?" "Ready, Mr. Nolan," she said, standing and pulling him to his feet. They walked into their home together, hand in hand, partners in all things. Two people who had found each other in the midst of chaos and accusation, and built something beautiful that would last for generations. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night and enclosing them in warmth and light and love. In the years that followed, the Nolan Ranch became one of the most successful in the Arizona Territory. James grew up to be a fine rancher like his father, eventually taking over more of the daily operations as Samuel grew older. Rose, with her bright mind and generous heart, became a teacher in Snowflake. educating the children of the community and carrying on her mother's legacy of helping others. Thomas found his calling in medicine, studying in the East before returning to Arizona to serve the people of the frontier who desperately needed doctors. Samuel and Natalie grew old together, their hair turning gray, their faces acquiring lines that spoke of years of laughter and hard work and love. They sat on their porch in the evenings, as they always had, watching sunsets and talking about their day and holding hands like the young couple they'd once been. When Samuel died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Natalie beside him and his children and grandchildren gathered around, his last words were of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered to Natalie, who was holding his hand and crying quietly. "Thank you for saying yes, for building this life with me for every single day." "Thank you for believing in me," Natalie whispered back, kissing his forehead. "Thank you for knowing I wasn't a thief, for fighting for me, for loving me so well." Natalie lived for 5 more years after Samuel's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that she and Samuel had built something that would endure long after they were gone. She spent her final years telling stories about the early days of the ranch, about the time she was falsely accused and the cowboy who stood up for her, about the love that had sustained them through decades of joy and sorrow. When she died in her sleep at the age of 81, they buried her next to Samuel on the hill overlooking the ranch, under the endless Arizona sky. Her grandchildren stood at the graveside and listened as her son James told the story one more time, the story of how his parents had met, how his father had known with certainty that his mother was innocent, how that single moment of faith had created a legacy of love that continued to shape their family. Grandpa used to say that the best decision he ever made was trusting his instincts about Grandma, James said, his voice rough with emotion. He said he knew in his heart that she was honest and good, and he wasn't going to let anyone say otherwise. That's the kind of love they had, the kind that fights for what's right, that believes even when it's hard, that builds something lasting. And there on that hill in Arizona, with red rocks rising in the distance and the wind whispering through the juniper trees, the Nolan family stood together and remembered 2 people who had loved each other deeply, who had overcome false accusations and hardship to build a life of meaning and purpose, who had left behind a legacy of courage and faith and enduring love. The ranch continued for generations, passed down from parent to child, each generation adding their own stories to the family history. But the story that was always told, the one that never got old, was the story of Natalie and Samuel, the woman who was falsely accused and the cowboy who said, "I know you're not a thief," and changed both their lives forever. It was a story of justice and faith, of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult, of the power of one person believing in another. But most of all, it was a love story, the kind that transcends time and circumstance, the kind that builds foundations that last for generations. And in Snowflake, Arizona, where their descendants still lived and worked and carried on their legacy, the story of Natalie Crawford and Samuel Nolan was told and retold, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the greatest blessings, and that love, when it's real and true and fought for, can overcome any obstacle. The general store where it all began was still standing, though it had changed hands many times over the years. But sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the Arizona sun blazed through the windows just right, people swore they could feel something in the air, a sense of history and destiny, a reminder of the day when a young woman's life fell apart, and a cowboy's faith put it back together in a way that was better than either of them could have imagined. And if you stood in just the right spot, where the preserves had once shattered on the wooden floor, and if you listened carefully, you might hear an echo of that long-ago voice, firm and certain and full of conviction. "I know you're not a thief." 7 words that changed everything. 7 words that saved a life, built a family, created a legacy. 7 words that proved that sometimes, when everything seems lost, all it takes is one person who believes in you to make all the difference in the world. That was the story of Natalie and Samuel Nolan, told and cherished and passed down through generations, a testament to the power of love, faith, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And in the hearts of their descendants, who carried their names and their values forward into new generations, that story lived on, as alive and meaningful as it had been on that hot Arizona afternoon in 1882, when it all began.